Today, we continue our conversation with Chapter's host, Eliot Parker. We'll discuss his background and look at his published works. Why did you start in journalism as opposed to starting in creative writing or education or something like that?
That's a great question. I'd always been fascinated with, my mother was a huge reader. My father wasn't as big of a reader, but he loved to listen to the radio. And so we always had the radio on. My grandfather, his dad, was a huge Cincinnati Reds fan. And so I can remember staying with them in the summertime, going and visiting them in the summertime. The radio was always on. And at that time, WCHS radio carried the Reds, which I think they still do, which is 580 AM in Charleston. They still carried the Reds. And I can remember, my grandfather in the spring and the summer always had the radio on. And my dad, growing up in that environment, he listened to the radio all the time. So I was fascinated by that whole dynamic of being able to tell a story without actually having anything in front of you or without the person listening having anything in front of them. I can remember as a kid growing up, there was a small radio station. It wasn't WCHS. It was a different radio station at the time, and I can't remember the call letters now, but they were a mutual radio network affiliate at the time. And I would go to bed at night listening to them. Larry King came on back when Larry King had a radio show. He came on, I think, at 9 o'clock. Bob Costas, when he had his radio show, Costas Coast to Coast, was on at 10 o'clock. And, of course, this was in the era before social media, before Facebook, before 24-hour news networks. And so, Bob Costas had all the big names on. He had Joe Montana and Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and all those guys that I remember growing up. So he came on at 10 o'clock. And then that affiliate in Charleston, because they were a mutual broadcasting affiliate, was carrying the Los Angeles Dodgers games. And so at 10 o'clock, 10:30, when the Dodgers would be playing out on the West Coast, Vin Scully would come on. And what a treat that was to listen to him, paint this whole image of the game and tell you everything about what was going on in the game through words. And so I had three different styles of people I listened to. Larry King was very talk-oriented, controversial-oriented. Bob Costas was the sports interview, and then listening to Vin Scully. So that really got me interested in radio. And I decided to go into journalism. I joined. There was an Explorers Club that I joined in high school that was at WCHS television at the time, and that Explorers Club, we got to go down to the station. We got to learn how they produce the newscast. We got to sit on the set. We got to see how the weatherman does that, how they put everything together. So that really got me interested, and I thought that was a good line of work to go into. I felt that was something that would be interesting. It wouldn't be the same every day, and a lot of journalists will tell you that one of the things they like about that profession is that no 2 days are the same. Every day is different, no matter if you're covering a beat or covering a certain topic or whatever. It's different every day. So I enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed the opportunity to go into a profession where that would be the case. I'm not much for routine. I like things to be different and have things changed up. So that's why I went into journalism. I came to Marshall a couple times when I was in high school for different clubs and camps, and got to go to the journalism school. They took us down to the Herald-Dispatch here in Huntington, the newsroom. We got to go to Channel 3 and look around. So really that got me interested at an early age, those experiences. But I can just remember my dad always listening to the radio, my grandfather listening to the radio, listening to Vin Scully, Bob Costas, Larry King back then. So that's what really got me interested in journalism, that whole idea that you can have this conversation or this interaction with people, and that person listening not able to see who the person is talking to them, but still have an interesting sort of conversation or dialogue between those two entities through this little device that only emitted sound. So that's really what got me interested in journalism.
You actually did radio work and that sort of thing?
Yes. I worked at Bristol Broadcasting. At one time they were Tri-Cities Media. They're headquartered now out of Bristol, Virginia, but now Bristol Broadcasting is their name. So I worked for them for about 5 years. I did some copy editing, some copywriting work, wrote some advertising copy for the commercials that you hear, helped write some sales proposals for the company, did some on-air work. My beat was University of Charleston and West Virginia State, so we covered football and men's basketball for both of those schools. During the end of my time there, University of Charleston got football back. They had been a basketball-only school for a long time. They brought their football team back. So my last year or so working there, we got to cover University of Charleston football, which is really exciting. But that was my beat, so I did that kind of on the weekends and did the other stuff during the week. But I enjoyed that really well. But when I was there too, the media profession was really going through a change. It was going through a scenario where a lot of radio stations and newspapers, were being bought up by conglomerates. And this would have been in the late '90s, early 2000s when this was going on when I was working there. And So people I had worked with, people that had mentored me there, were now leaving, or they were being transferred elsewhere because the corporate umbrella was moving them different places. And so that's when I decided, I could sense where this was going, and I felt like it was time to make a change. I enjoyed everything about working there. I enjoyed the people I worked with, the people I worked for. Working with the student athletes at the schools and the coaches was a great fun. Going on the road trips with the teams was a lot of fun. But I just felt like after 5 years, I was starting to see a shift in the media landscape. And of course, we've had several shifts in the media landscape since then, with social media and 24-hour news and Politico and all these online news sites and companies that have grown up out of that. But I just felt like at that time it was a good time to make a change, and that's kind of when I pivoted towards education.
I know you've written several books and that sort of thing. So how about writing from that angle? I mean, was that always something you did, or did that really start once you were in education, or how?
It's interesting. It really did start seriously for me when I got into education. I've been at Mount West Community Technical College for 12 years. I taught and worked at Marsh University for 3 years before that. So about the last 15 years I've been in education. I didn't really have time before I got into education to write consistently. I'd always written as a hobby. I would write little short stories here and there and play with some poetry here and there. But once I went into education and started, my work life became 16-week chunks of time. So I'd have a fall semester that would start and it would end in December, and then I wouldn't go back until mid-January, and that semester would go until mid-May. Then I wouldn't go back until August or September of the next time. So I suddenly had these big breaks that I didn't have before when I was working in radio, because it was an all year round kind of thing. So I really started getting into writing once I made that shift to education. When I think back to, I was talking earlier about books being a huge part of my life, and about my mother always having books and that always being a huge part of what went on, and my dad, on the other hand, listening to the radio all the time. I can remember the first series of books I really loved as a kid was the Encyclopedia Brown Mysteries. And he was a great little kid. He was kind of a savant kid. He was the smartest kid in the neighborhood, and the storyline was he would solve little mysteries going on in the neighborhood, and he charged you a quarter. You had to put a quarter in his gasoline can cup, and he would solve your mystery. And unfortunately, the author, whose name escapes me right now, just passed away a few years ago. But that was really the first series of books I can remember reading and really enjoying. Then, not long after that, Scholastic came out with a series of books that were called Mystery by Numbers. So you would read this mystery story, you would get to page 45, and it would say, if you want Johnny to do this to solve the case, turn to page 60. If you think Johnny should do this, turn to page 45. So you got to choose your own mystery and determine ultimately, was the case solved or not. So I really enjoyed that too, and it's really from those two series of books when I really got into mystery writing or mystery reading, I should say, and that was really my kind of foray into that. And I read everything. I mean, I read science fiction, fantasy, romance, nonfiction. I kind of get into these kicks. I'll read fiction for a while, and get tired of that, and read nonfiction for a while. Get tired of that, read biography for a while. And where I really started formalizing writing, Doug, was when I was in college at Marshall. I mentioned I was a journalism major. I had a good friend, Zach, who was an English major. And at that time, a lot of journalism majors had to take English classes, and English majors could take journalism classes for their graduation requirements. So we had a lot of overlap. We saw a lot of each other, English and journalism majors in each other's classes. And so he wanted to start a creative writing club at Marshall. And he said, in order for me to get a charter and for us to be a sanctioned club, we have to meet so many times a year and we have to have so many members. And he said, and I said, I'm doing, kind of the broadcasting. I was working at the Parthenon at the time, Marshall student newspaper. I said, I'm not really writing fiction and poetry and that kind of thing. Although, I played with it some, but not serious. Wasn't serious like he was with it. And he said, I don't care. He said, I just want you to show up and keep the chair warm so I can count you as someone there. I said, fine. So I did it. That was my junior year at Marshall. Came back my senior year, and I stuck with it. So they got their charter eventually. And I don't even remember what the name of the club was now. It's been so long ago. But they got their charter as a sanctioned club. Well, the next year I just kind of hung around because I liked the group that was there. And we made an agreement. We said, this year, by the end of this year, we're going to work on a piece. We're going to develop something starting in September. And by the end of the school year, which would have been April or May, we're going to submit our work for publication. Whatever we've been working on and talking about and revising and workshopping as a group, we're going to send this out for publication. Doesn't mean it has to be published, but you've got to at least take that step and send it out. And in that group, I was with creative writing majors and people that really wanted to be writers. So that was a big step for them. So I participated in that. I wrote a little short story called Hands, which was sort of a mystery ghost tale kind of story that was involving a person who encounters a ghost at a cemetery, and this ghost is a relative of someone that he's wronged earlier in his life, and she's come back to kind of let him know, hey, our family hasn't forgotten all these years later. But there was a little small literary journal at Mary Washington College in Virginia that accepted my story and published it in their little literary anthology. And that was the first time that I ever had something published. That was the first time I realized, maybe I could do this. Maybe there is someone out there who likes what I write and likes how I write and likes the way I tell a story. So it really started from there. And then I started getting into mystery writing. And Breakdown at Clear River was my first novel that came out in 2012, and it's a murder mystery set on a fictional college campus in West Virginia. And the main story there involves 3 football players, Cullen Brewer, Jordan Hansel, and Dane Antonelli, who are getting ready for their senior season at this fictional school called Clear River College in northern West Virginia. And the expectations are that they're going to win the conference championship this year. They came close in the previous year. Cullen's a senior, Jordan's a senior, Dane is a freshman, but he's a highly touted freshman. So they're getting ready for the season. Well, as the season gets ready to start, Dane's found murdered. And they found him in a dormitory stairwell on the college campus right before the semester starts. And so the mystery kind of takes 2 tracks. You've got the school and the university and the alumni and all of those folks trying to kind of sweep under the rug what happened to Dane. And then his friends are starting to realize, wait a minute, what they're telling us just doesn't make sense. This isn't how Dane is. We know Dane. He wouldn't do these things and act this way. So they go on the real quest for the investigation. And where I got my inspiration for that was my radio work. Working at West Virginia State, working at University of Charleston, being on those college campuses, hanging around college kids, being in the locker room interviewing players, seeing the dynamics between players, how they interacted and related. The fact that I work on a college campus most of the time, it felt comfortable and familiar to me. And this was my first foray in writing a novel, so I thought, I need to make this as easy on myself as possible. So why not set it on a college campus, a place I know well? Why not center it around a group of people that I know pretty well in terms of college students? And I work with college students every day too, in addition to being on a college campus. So that was my first foray in novel writing, and it was a finalist for the Weatherford Award for Outstanding Appalachian Fiction in 2012, and it was my first. It got Kirkus Reviews reviewed it and gave it positive reviews. Ford Magazine reviewed it and gave it very positive reviews. The Providence Journal, I believe it was the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, did a nice write-up of the book. My publisher sent it up to them, and they did a very nice review. So I started realizing, maybe I could take the short story skill that I developed in college, and now that I've got time to pursue this a little more, and I've got these long breaks, maybe this would give me some time to write novels. And that's really where the novel writing and the mystery novel writing started for me, was that first book, Breakdown at Clear River.
How many books do you have published, and what all are you into as far as publishing your own work?
Well, my second book came out called Making Arrangements, and the subtitle to that book is Inheriting a Family Funeral Home Leads to Trouble. This is not a murder mystery. Not long after Breakdown at Clear River came out, my father was diagnosed, who I talked about a moment ago, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and passed away. And so he was a funeral director, owned a funeral home, and my family still does in Charleston. And so I kind of wrote that book really kind of in memory of him. I had wanted to tell a story about his profession and what he did, because it's so misunderstood, and so many people make jokes about it and kind of he wink wink when they talk about death and funeral homes and people that do that line of work. But I want to tell a story that kind of not only was interesting in terms of the dynamics of that business, but show what a funeral director really does. And so that book centers on a character named Colin Madsen, whose father has passed away, and he's left Colin the funeral home, and Colin doesn't want it. It takes place in Concord, Massachusetts, and I have a good friend I went to college with that's from that area, and so I wanted to center it somewhere outside of West Virginia. And although Concord, Massachusetts is very similar to Huntington, Charleston in terms of how it's set up, and then Boston is not too far away. Boston's maybe an hour, so it would be like Concord would be Huntington, and Boston would be Charleston, or Concord would be Portsmouth, and Columbus would be Boston. I mean, yeah, very close together, but two separate kind of communities. So Colin's got this big accounting job for a huge firm in Boston. His father passes away. He leaves in the business. Colin doesn't know what to do with it. The Attorney General's office, Secretary of State's office, has been constantly contacting him as the next of kin, saying, and as the head of the estate, saying, "You got to do something about this business, or we're going to come and take it." So it's Christmas Day, or Christmas Eve, I think is when it starts, and he's got to decide what is he going to do. He's got to the first of the year to do something with this business. So all along that whole process, he reconnects with Ava Hewitt, who was a childhood friend that grew up behind the funeral home where Colin grew up. She comes back into the picture, and they've had sort of an on-again, off-again kind of relationship and friendship. And then Colin's brother Owen enters the picture, and Owen very much wants to sell the business. He's only concerned about money. He wants to take the money from the business and divide it up, and he can go on his way. So it's a story about family dynamics. It's a story about what does legacy mean? What is a legacy when your family owns a business and a business has been a part of a community, and suddenly the head of that business is gone, and it's now left to his children, and one wants to keep it, one wants to sell it, one wants to not keep it because they don't want anything to do with it, one of them wants to use it as sort of a cash cow. So it's that kind of a story, so more of a family drama story. That came out in 2014. USA Book News named it a best book of 2014, so I was really honored to have them do that. And I think about my dad often, because I think how proud he would be that not only does this book kind of show what funeral directors do, but that it did so well that USA Book News thought it was good. My most recent book, which came out in 2015, is Fragile Brilliance. I'm doing a little something different with this book. I'm foraying into a series, which is something I've never done. Breakdown at Clear River was a standalone. Making Arrangements was a standalone. Fragile Brilliance is going to be the first in a series. And this is set in Charleston. I set this one back in Charleston, and it focuses on a Charleston police sergeant named Ronan McCullough. And when the book opens, he responds to the assault of a college student outside a downtown sports bar in Charleston, a fictional downtown sports bar. Not only is the college student brutally attacked, but when Ronan tries to intervene, the three men that he's trying to stop turn on him and nearly beat him to death. And so Ronan starts to figure out, who were these guys? Why didn't they respond? Why didn't they stop when I told them to? I mean, Ronan draws his weapon. He says, "Hey, I'm police. Leave this kid alone," and they just ignore him and then finally turn on him. So as he starts to investigate who these three men are, what are they doing here, why were they after Michael Warner, who was the college student attacked, he uncovers a whole lot of different sets of circumstances for who these guys are and what they're really up to. And what he ultimately finds out is that there's a criminal syndicate moving in on Charleston, and this act against that college student was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. And then Ronan also has some other personal challenges. He is gay. So he lives with his partner, who's named Ty Endino, who is an emergency room nurse at Charleston Mercy Hospital, which is loosely based on Charleston General Hospital in Charleston, which is where my mom worked. So I got another little tie in there about a personal experience. And the problem with that is they have to keep this relationship hidden, because if people within the police department knew that Ronan was gay, it would ruin his career. So as the story unfolds, you've got that whole dynamic, trying to have a relationship where so much of what happens in the story overlaps. Because, for example, when those criminals are as of course the story unfolds, and those criminals get involved with Ronan and they get in confrontations with the police, they're taken to the emergency room and Ty's the one that treats them. So as much as they try to keep themselves separate and keep their relationship separate, there's so much overlap there. So that's another sort of underlying thread in the storyline. Plus then, Ronan's estranged nephew, Nick Copeland, who has been living in Florida with Nick's estranged sister, shows up at their doorstep. He's had a fight with his mother, who has married a real estate mogul named Bruce, who's just a brute of a human being. He doesn't like Nick, doesn't really want to be a stepfather. And he basically throws Nick out, and so Nick has nowhere else to go. So he gets on a Greyhound bus and goes all the way up to West Virginia and shows up on Ronan's doorstep in the midst of all of this. So you got a lot of things going on there. But I'm doing a series on that. I'm working on the sequel right now, which is going to be called A Knife's Edge. But this book I love to write because it was a stretch for me. I had never handled so many multiple storylines before, so many different plot threads, and keeping them all sort of together, but then tying it all together at the end, bringing all these little aspects of the plot together into a cohesive story was a great challenge for me. But I was pleased that this book received a lot of recognition. It was a finalist for the Pat Conroy Southern Book Prize in 2016 for Best Mystery Thriller Writing. I was on a list with John Grisham. I was on a list with Ace Adkins. I was on a list with Greg Iles. I mean, people that I've grown up reading and admire greatly. To have my book on the same list and in the same conversation with them was tremendously rewarding. And then in October of 2016, I received the Award for Literary Merit from the West Virginia Library Association for Fragile Brilliance and for all of my books. And so that was a wonderful honor to have librarians across West Virginia say, you know, this is a writer you need to be reading. This is a writer whose books are on par with anything else we carry in the library. Was a great honor. So I'm working on the sequel to that. My latest book, I'm doing another series with another detective, a Cleveland, Ohio police detective, homicide detective named Stacy Tabbett. The first book in that series is called Code for Murder. That will be out in September of 2017 from Black Rose Press. So I've got sort of two series going. I've got the Ronin series going, and I've got Stacy's series going, and I kind of go back and forth. So I finished the first book in the Stacy series. Now I'm going back to dealing with Ronin and those characters. When I'm done there, I'll go back to Stacy and work. That's helped me not get too worn out or too tired with dealing with these characters. When you're doing a series, you spend a lot of time with these characters, but at the same time, also when I come back to that book after I've had some time away, I'm much more fresh and focused when it comes to doing that. So, and then I've got some standalone stuff I'm working on as well. But writing a series has been fun because in a way you get to carry the same characters over from your previous story, but it's challenging too, Doug, because they've got to grow. You can't. Ronan can't be the same Ronan he was in Fragile Brilliance. Yes, he's going to have similar, all of his characteristics about his personality are going to stay the same, but how does he grow? And that's been the challenge I've learned, and how is Ty going to grow, and how is Nick going to grow, and how are all these characters that I established in the first book going to grow as the plot or the main plot of the story changes. So I found that to be, readers of series want to see, and I'm this way too as a reader. When I'm reading a series, I want to see the character grow and evolve, and so I found that's been an interesting challenge with writing A Knife's Edge, which is the title of the second Ronan McCullough book, because I want him to stay true to who he is, and I want Ty to stay true to who he is. But I also, at the same time, I want them to grow. I want them to develop into characters that readers see kind of going through the ups and downs of their lives as they go through the story.
You have to have a story. You have to have an arc.
Yes.
You have to start someplace and end up somewhere else, or what's the point?
Absolutely. And I'll say this too, Doug, about, mystery readers are so smart. And they know if, I don't want to say they know if you're being false in your writing, but they know if you don't have a good plot. They know if your story arc is weak. They know if a character hasn't grown in book 2 and they're the same static character that they were in book 1. Mystery readers are so smart. I've had a great opportunity to interact with a lot of them on social media. People email me questions on my website all the time. I meet people at book fairs and we talk all the time, and people that have read my book or read my other books are so smart, and they pick up on the little smallest things that, the color of someone's eyes or a gesture someone made in chapter 13 that I just kind of thought was innocuous, and I just put in there to kind of move the story along. They come and ask you a question, they'll say something like, well, when Ronan looked at Ty that way, what was the real meaning there in chapter 16 on page 108? And I don't even remember really what I put on chapter 16 on page 108. But they're so smart and they're so good at picking up little things. So I love writing in this genre. I love coming up with a compelling arc that's going to hold the reader through. But I also have to realize, you can't cut any shortcuts with mystery and thriller readers, because they'll pick up on that, and they know that, and they know if you're being genuine, and they know if you've got a strong story or not. So that creates another challenge, writing in this genre. And when you look at genres, the 3 genres that sell the most books. This is nationwide, and this is electronic books, this is paperback books, this is hardback books. Romance is number 1, mystery thrillers number 2, science fiction fantasies 3. So I'm writing in a genre that's the second most read genre in the country, and this might be in the world. I mean, I'm sure world statistics are the same, but even in the country. So it presents some challenges as a writer too. You really have to be on top of your game when you write in this genre, because readers are going to know if you're not.
Well, you bring up something that I hear a lot of the authors you talk to you about, and that is the business.
Well, it's been really an educational experience for me. You know, when I did Breakdown at Clear River, and I started working on that book in about 2008. So I worked on it some and put it aside some, and came back and, you know, fooled with it some and put it away for a while. And as I was getting my teaching career really underway and getting my feet established there, so once that got stronger and situated, and I was able to really focus on the book probably in about 2011, 10 or 11 or so. I thought, well, you know, I'm just going to write this book and I'm going to send it to a publisher, and I'm just going to put that out there, and that's it. You know, once the publisher publishes it, it's going to be on every single bookstore in the country. It's going to be on the Barnes & Noble must-read list. It's going to be on everything. And I came to find out that that is not really how it works. There is a whole business component to this that I learned a lot about. I learned about wholesalers and distributors. And I think writers need to really understand what that is and what the difference is. A distributor is someone who's going to contact the bookstores and say, hey, Eliot Parker's got a new book out. It's about such and such and this and that, and you need to stock that in your store. A wholesaler is going to be the person who has your book on, I don't want to say in storage, but has your book on hand, so that if a Barnes & Noble calls and says, I want 5 copies for my shelf, my mystery thriller shelf, or my local author shelf, they're able to get those, and they're able to get those quickly. And those are two things that I didn't know worked in tandem with one another. And you can have a wholesaler or no distributor. You can have a distributor or no wholesaler. So, you know, when I look for publishers, I look for, you know, places that are going to, places that are interested in my work. That's one of the things I look at. One of the first questions I ask, you know, who's your distributor and who's your wholesaler? Because that's what's going to get your book out there and get your book noticed. So that's the first thing I learned about the business side. Second thing I learned is you as the writer are going to be the best advocate for your book. You can have a wholesaler. I mean, been fortunate to have great wholesalers. National Book Network out of Pennsylvania does the wholesaling for Fragile Brilliance. Ingram and several other, I have several distributors for that book, do a good job of doing that. But ultimately, you're the best salesperson for the book. You know, you know more about the book than anybody else does. And I think another thing that I've learned is how important it is to get out and make yourself available. And what I mean by available is going and speaking to book clubs, going and speaking to, going to open mic events and reading your work, going to book festivals and book fairs, going to any place that you have a chance to, going to craft festivals, going to places like that. Any place where you can go and talk about your book, have copies of your book on hand, and sell your book is also a huge part of the process of the business side. And publishers are going to ask you that many times. If you go the route of publication, they're going to ask you, they're going to say, you know, what are your plans to promote the book? And as a writer, you better be prepared to have some answers, because they're going to determine, in many, not always, but in many cases, they're going to determine when and how much of a book contract, or how leveled of a book contract, or layered of a book contract are they going to offer you based on that. And so I've learned that, and I, you know, even though I teach, you know, as a career, and even though, you know, I do the chapters program all the time and do some other things, you know, I'm pretty much introverted. Most writers are. I mean, I can go a whole day and not talk to anybody, and I'm thrilled. You know, I can talk to people, but if I don't, I'm fine. So it's hard for writers oftentimes to step out of that comfort zone and become not just the writer of the book, but the salesman for the book. So those are the aspects of the business that I learned pretty quickly. That, you know, who's your wholesaler and your distributor? How are they going to work in tandem or with one another, with your publisher, to get your book out there so that people can read it? But also, what can you do as the writer to promote your book, and where can you do it? And I found that on the author part of it, in terms of being your own salesman, the more you get out there, things are kind of cyclical. So what I mean by that is, you go and speak to a certain group, or you go speak to a book club, and then somebody in that book club knows somebody in another book club, and they say, hey, you know, we read this great book by Eliot Parker, and it's called such and such. And, you know, he'll come talk to your book group if you read his book. Well, next thing you know, you go to that book club. And then somebody in that book club knows somebody in another book club, and it has a spiral effect. Or you go to an arts festival, arts and crafts festival. I've gone to the Milton Pumpkin Festival, for example, and done really well selling books. But you meet people there, and somebody says, hey, you know what? have you been to the such and such festival and so and where and wherever? And you say, well, no, I haven't. Well, you need to go up there because you'd sell a lot of books there. So you build this network, and kind of one thing leads to another. And next thing you know, you go from maybe only having 2 or 3 ways to promote your book, and now you've got 5 or 10 or 15 or 20, and things kind of build and are cyclical that way. But you can't be afraid, you can't be ashamed, you can't be shy. Just go out there, talk about your book, talk about why you wrote it, talk about what makes it special to you, because anybody is going to talk to you about a book, because having a book and having that tangible book in front of you is a huge accomplishment, and that's going to draw people to talk to you about why did you write it, how did you write it, how long did it take you. So it's going to be a natural conversation starter anywhere you go. Even if you're not going to a book club or someplace like that, or a literary event. So then from there, you just need to be prepared to answer those questions. Why did you write it? Why do you like to write? Because oftentimes that's the way you get that conversation started. But don't be shy and don't be afraid to go out. And that's what I've learned. You're the best. You're the best advocate for your book. And if you don't speak up for your book, nobody else is going to.